CEO goes undercover in his own factory. What he overheard made him shut it down immediately. Before we get into this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories like these, make sure to subscribe, as we upload at the same time every day. He stood at the entrance of the factory, trying to calm his nerves. The roar of machinery spilled through open bay doors, and workers in grease-stained coveralls shuffled by without so much as a glance. Ethan Carter, billionaire CEO, was dressed in cheap jeans and a worn-out t-shirt under a dull-colored jacket. He made sure to trim away his usual polish, no expensive watch, no sleek haircut. He was here incognito, responding to the flood of complaints he'd received, anonymous emails warning that something was terribly wrong on the manufacturing floor. He thought he knew his own company well. After all, he'd founded it, poured years of his life into it, and believed he treated his employees with respect. But as he took a shaky breath, Ethan realized he had absolutely no idea what he was about to walk into. The air inside was thick with the tang of machine oil, and his boots crunched against a grimy concrete floor. He noticed the stifling heat first. It was suffocating, even at 6 in the morning. Most employees already wore sweat on their brows, their faces drawn. It felt like a place where the slightest shift could spark tension, and Ethan couldn't ignore the knot coiling in his gut. He approached an older man named Tom, introduced himself as just another temp, and Tom gave a cursory nod. Tom was broad-shouldered, with tired eyes and a limp from decades of this harsh work. Without any introduction, Tom handed him a pair of scuffed gloves and told him, "Work's tough here, but keep your head down and you'll survive." It was the word survive that chilled Ethan. Survive implied a struggle he didn't think existed in his own company. Still, he pasted on a friendly smile, following Tom deeper into the factory. The noise level rose significantly as they neared the assembly line. Heavy presses slammed into sheets of metal, robotic arms hissed, and conveyor belts rattled under constant motion. Ethan could barely hear himself think, and he wondered how anyone lasted more than a few hours in these conditions. Tom led him to a station where small components were being fitted into larger frames. The task seemed simple: place the part, press the button, move on. But one glance around told him that repetition had worn these workers thin. Arms moved mechanically, eyes distant, posture slumped. Even Tom, who looked tough as nails, sighed as he positioned Ethan at a small bench. "You'll get used to the racket," Tom yelled over the din. Ethan gave a thumbs up, hoping to blend in. He asked quietly, "So how long you been here?" Tom shrugged. "Long enough." That was all he said. With that, Ethan began his first day on the floor he ostensibly owned, but the idea felt laughable in that moment. He realized that, to these people, he was just another pair of hands. And in a twisted sense, that was a good thing. That was exactly why he came undercover: to see, to feel, to learn. He'd barely gotten through the first hour when a wiry supervisor named Brad stormed onto the scene, his voice slicing through the clamorous factory like a blade. He barked orders at a young worker, Liam, maybe in his early 20s, telling him to speed it up or you're out. Liam's face went pale, his hands fumbling with the pieces he was working on. Something in Brad's tone made Ethan bristle. It wasn't just the harshness. It was the utter lack of respect, the sense that these workers were nothing more than replaceable cogs in a giant machine. Yet, no one said a word to defend Liam, and Liam himself only muttered an apology before slaving away faster. Tom shot Ethan a warning glance, as if to say, "Don't get involved." Ethan nodded, pretending to refocus on his task. Still, he watched Brad stride down the line, poking at each worker's pace, glaring at them as if they were children. As soon as Brad moved on, Tom whispered to Ethan, "He's worse when he thinks no one important is looking." Ethan felt a flash of anger. Brad, apparently, had no clue the CEO he was supposed to respect was standing right there. And that was precisely the point of this entire exercise: to see what really happened when upper management wasn't around. The next table over was overseen by a middle-aged woman with calloused hands and a warm, if weary, smile. She introduced herself as Maria. "You knew?" she asked, glancing at Ethan's shaky attempts to align components. He nodded, grateful for a friendlier face. Maria was a single mother, he soon learned, juggling odd shifts and barely scraping by. She had a son in elementary school and couldn't afford daycare, so she swapped hours and borrowed favors just to keep her family afloat. "Don't let Brad get to you," she confided, offering a faint smile. "But watch yourself." Her voice trailed off as Brad returned, hovering like a storm cloud. Ethan forced himself to remain calm. This was his company, he kept reminding himself. But the tension in the air suggested that if the corporate office had any idea how people were treated on these lines, they'd be appalled. Or so he hoped. Quickly, he turned back to his station, pretending to be busy. Yet his mind whirled with questions. How many complaints had he ignored because the official reports never reached him? How complicit was he by simply trusting that his delegated managers did the right thing? Brad's booming voice made everyone jump again. This time he singled out Maria, who apparently had requested a short break to use the restroom after hours of standing in place. "You think you can just walk off whenever you feel like it? Get your numbers up first," Brad snapped. Maria's cheeks reddened, but she said nothing. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. A basic, humane request turned into a public shaming. He suppressed the urge to yell at Brad then and there. Instead, he quietly asked Tom, "Does this happen often?" Tom grimly replied, "You have no idea." And with that, Ethan felt his stomach twist. He knew, in that moment, that whatever he discovered here might force him to make drastic changes, if not for moral reasons, then simply because it was the right thing to do. This was the life of his workers, and he had no clue how dire it had become. The first hour was a rude awakening. He couldn't imagine what the rest of the day would reveal. Ethan fought the urge to storm into the management office right then. But he'd promised himself he'd learn from the ground level before taking action. Still, the first red flag was already blindingly obvious. Employees were being dehumanized. Every time Brad walked by, it felt like a bomb ticking down to detonation. The tone he used with Maria, the fear he instilled in Liam, the resigned acceptance in Tom's eyes, it all clashed with the company culture Ethan thought he'd created. This was supposed to be a place of opportunity. Instead, it felt more like a fortress with an invisible moat, where the guards were overworked and the generals never left their towers. He spent the next few hours trying to keep pace with the repetitive tasks, but the real work was in observing. He caught snatches of hushed conversations. People talked about working double shifts with no overtime pay, about strange paycheck deductions that never got explained, about how they feared complaining because you'll just get replaced. Ethan was no stranger to hard work. He'd built his company from a rented garage, once upon a time. But he'd always prided himself on treating employees like family. Or at least, that was the vision he sold to shareholders and the public. Now he could see the cracks in that story. Tom confided in him that Brad had fired 2 people last week for insubordination. But really they were just raising concerns about safety protocols. "These machines," Tom said, gesturing at a hulking piece of equipment that pressed metal parts at lightning speed, "they need regular maintenance. And we used to have a proper schedule for that. But now, management says it costs too much." Ethan flinched at the phrase. Costs too much. Every life in that factory was worth more than any cost-cutting measure. The logic behind skipping maintenance was baffling and horrifying. He thought about how many corners might have been cut in the name of profit. And if the CEO himself hadn't caught wind of it, who authorized such decisions? When Maria finally took a short break, Ethan quietly followed, pretending to get a drink of water. He found her hunched over a small sink in the corner, splashing her face. She looked exhausted. "I'm fine," she said preemptively, though he hadn't even asked. Her voice trembled. They docked my pay last week for being unproductive. But my station broke down for an hour, and we were all standing around waiting for repairs." She paused, her eyes welling with tears. "I can't afford to lose even a penny." Ethan's heart sank. He wanted to comfort her, to assure her that things would change, but he couldn't tip his hand. All he could do was say, "That doesn't seem fair." She let out a bitter laugh. Fair doesn't live here. Ethan returned to his station, his mind swimming. Every time he glanced down the row, he saw Brad scrutinizing someone else, scribbling notes on a clipboard as if searching for new reasons to write people up. A single mother losing money over a broken machine was unacceptable. Tom's story about skipping maintenance was downright dangerous. Liam cowering from a threat of termination for simply not being fast enough made Ethan's blood boil. This wasn't some happenstance. It was a pattern. A system designed to squeeze every drop of labor out of people and discard them when they were too drained to keep going. He realized that while he'd been sitting in a distant office, trusting executive reports, these supervisors had been creating their own tyrannical mini-empire. Was that the entire story, though? Were other factories like this, or was it just this one? He feared the answer might be bleaker than he could handle. By midday, Ethan was drenched in sweat. His muscles ached from the repetitive motions, and his nerves felt shot from the oppressive atmosphere. Tom, despite his own fatigue, tried to help Ethan when he fell behind. "Take it slow," Tom advised. "Brad's not around right now. You don't want to injure yourself." That small gesture of kindness made Ethan respect Tom even more. Here was a man who had every reason to be jaded, yet he still found it in himself to look out for a stranger. Meanwhile, it seemed the supervisors and potentially the entire middle management chain had long forgotten how to treat people with basic decency. For a moment, Ethan fantasized about marching up to Brad, revealing who he was, and firing him on the spot. But he held back. He needed to see everything with his own eyes first. Only then could he deliver a decisive blow to this toxic structure. He walked past a stacked pallet of boxes and heard hushed voices. One belonged to Liam. "They took another $50 out of my paycheck," Liam was whispering to a colleague. "Said it was for equipment fees. But I never signed anything like that. I can't afford rent if they keep doing this." The colleague murmured something about shutting up and not attracting Brad's attention. Ethan felt a surge of guilt. These were the men and women who kept his business running, and they were being robbed of wages through sketchy deductions. Without any recourse, they were simply forced to accept it. He swallowed hard and stepped back to his workstation. He'd heard enough. The first red flag was no minor detail. It was a glaring siren that signaled deeper corruption. He had no idea how many layers of this rotten onion he'd have to peel back before finding the root cause, but he knew one thing: if this was the reality, shutting the place down might be the only way to truly clean house and start over. Ethan tried to keep his composure as the day wore on. He played the part of a clueless temp, asking Tom questions about the processes, quietly listening when others complained under their breath. The more he listened, the more he realized just how hidden this crisis had been from him. The corporate memos were always so optimistic. "Production is up. Worker satisfaction is at a high." But here, on the ground, was a starkly different picture. He noticed Maria struggling to lift a box of parts that was clearly beyond the recommended weight. No safety harness, no partner system, nothing to prevent a potential injury. When she finally dropped the box in exhaustion, Brad conveniently appeared. He sneered down at her. "You break it, you buy it," he said, voice dripping with disdain. She stammered, "It's just too heavy. Can I get some help?" He pointedly checked his watch. "If you spent less time complaining, you might keep up." Ethan clenched his jaw, trying not to interfere just yet, but the anger boiled inside him. The casual cruelty was almost unbelievable. If this was how Brad acted in broad daylight, with a dozen witnesses, Ethan shuddered to think what happened in quieter corners of the factory. During a short lull, Tom pulled Ethan aside. "You see this place for what it is now?" His voice was low, measured. "Been here for years. Watched it go from a decent job to a nightmare." Ethan nodded, trying to mask his inner turmoil. Tom continued, "Management started changing policies a while back. First they cut breaks short. Then they introduced these weird fees for equipment. Some folks here are barely breaking even." Ethan's mouth went dry. He had to ask, "Why not report it?" Tom let out a bitter laugh. "Who do we report to? HR is in on it, or at least they turn a blind eye. And you try going above them, Brad will find out. Next thing you know, you're unemployed. Ethan felt as if he were watching an avalanche in slow motion. One cut corner after another, one policy shift after another, until the entire factory was operating on a system of fear and exploitation. He thought of the anonymous complaints he received, about how they described an environment that was toxic beyond repair, and how he'd been skeptical at first. Now he felt ashamed for ever doubting them. Mid-afternoon, a shrill alarm sounded. Everyone scrambled to shut down their stations. One of the big machines had jammed. Sparks flew from its side, and a worker rushed to hit the emergency stop. Brad appeared, red-faced, yelling, "Who messed up? Who was on this machine?" A young woman raised her hand, terror etched on her features. She stammered that she followed all procedures. The machine just malfunctioned. Instead of checking the machinery, Brad berated her, threatening a write-up. She stood there, trembling, tears brimming in her eyes. Ethan had to hold himself back. He wanted to scream at Brad, reveal his identity, and put a stop to this madness. But he remained silent. Part of him hated himself for it. Still, if he was going to take this place apart at the seams, he needed to see the full picture first. The alarm eventually stopped, and a maintenance crew was called, though they looked understaffed, like they could barely handle the massive equipment. The tension didn't dissipate, it lingered like a toxic fog. As the day dragged into evening, Ethan realized no one had taken a proper meal break. People were snacking on whatever they brought, or not at all. When he mustered the courage to ask Tom if there was a lunch break, Tom shrugged. "Used to be. Now it's working lunches if you want to keep your job." Ethan's stomach growled, but the pang in his heart was worse. This was inhumane. People can't function without a real break, yet here they were, churning out products hour after hour. And for what? So some line on a spreadsheet looked better to whoever was at the top, namely him, the CEO. The dissonance gnawed at him. Suddenly, Brad marched over again, leveling his gaze at Ethan. "Hey, newbie, pick up the pace," he snapped. "I don't care if it's your first day, we don't tolerate slackers." Ethan forced a nod, biting down the fiery retort that threatened to burst from his mouth. He turned back to his station. He could feel eyes on him, Maria, Liam, Tom, each giving him a look of sympathy. They probably assumed he'd learn the hard way not to cross Brad. Little did they know he'd soon be crossing Brad harder than anyone ever had. By the time the shift ended, Ethan was physically and emotionally drained. His shirt clung to his skin, his hands stung from minor cuts and scrapes, and his mind was an uproar of conflicting emotions. He left the factory floor without a word. Standing in the parking lot, he glanced back at the colossal building. Inside it lurked injustices that were inflicted daily on people who had no choice but to endure. He thought about the first red flag that day, Brad's open hostility, the forced denial of basic human needs like bathroom breaks, the shady paycheck deductions. If that was just the tip of the iceberg, he dreaded what he might uncover next. Yet, for the first time that day, he felt something akin to determination lighting up within him. He might have been blind before, but now his eyes were wide open. And if he had to tear down this entire system brick by brick, so be it. Ethan arrived the next day with renewed focus. The first red flag had already given him a jarring insight, and now he was determined to uncover the full scope of the hidden conflict roiling beneath the surface. He greeted Maria and Liam quietly, offering a gentle smile to show solidarity. Tom gave him a curt nod, as if to say, "Keep your head down, but stay strong." The shift began much like the previous day, with machines thundering, workers huddled over their tasks, and supervisors stalking the aisles. But Ethan noticed more details now. Half the protective gear was outdated or in disrepair. Safety goggles were scratched, gloves had holes, and earplugs were practically non-existent. He'd seen the official safety guidelines his company touted in glossy brochures. The reality on the ground was a cruel farce. Yet, no one openly complained. They just accepted it, as if complaining would do no good, or, worse, would get them fired. Mid-morning, A forklift beeped its way across the factory floor, carrying a towering load of materials. The driver looked exhausted, his uniform drenched in sweat, eyes bleary from what Ethan guessed was a double shift. Ethan wanted to ask him how long he'd been driving, but Brad appeared out of nowhere, barking at the driver to move faster. The forklift lurched, nearly tipping its load. Everyone nearby scattered for safety. Brad cursed, threatening to write the driver up. In that instant, Ethan saw the hidden conflict crystallize. These people were being pushed to their physical and mental limits, and when their compromised state caused mistakes or near accidents, management blamed them. It was a vicious cycle. Workers were run into the ground, and when accidents happened, the workers were scapegoated. The driver parked the forklift, turned the engine off, and slumped forward, visibly shaken. No one rushed to his aid. They just stood there, fear etched in their faces. Ethan sidled up to the man, asking if he was all right. The driver nodded weakly. "I'm just tired. Been at this for 12 hours. Got called in because they were short-staffed. Can't say no, or Brad might dock my hours altogether." Ethan offered a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. He wanted to promise him things would change, but he still couldn't blow his cover. So he just said, "That's rough. You should take a breather if you can." The man gave him a hollow laugh. "A breather? That's a good one." He climbed off the forklift and disappeared into the chaos of the factory. Ethan swallowed the urge to follow him, to do something more direct. But he knew he had to see it through systematically. Flying off the handle might momentarily feel good, but it wouldn't address the underlying power structures that let people like Brad thrive. Later, Ethan overheard a conversation between Liam and a maintenance worker who was examining a sputtering conveyor belt. The maintenance worker said, "We had to cannibalize parts from another machine because the budget for new parts got slashed last month. Told me to make do." Liam nodded, biting his lip. "Don't know how much longer these lines will last. They're ancient." The maintenance worker sighed. "I know. But every time I ask for replacements, I'm told to patch it up and keep quiet." Ethan felt a surge of disbelief. This wasn't just negligence. It was bordering on recklessness. Old equipment, improperly maintained, was an accident waiting to happen. And yet the fix was so simple: invest in maintenance. But clearly, someone higher up, someone in his own administrative chain, had deemed that cost too high. The hidden conflict was larger than just Brad's tyranny. It was a system that valued short-term profit over long-term safety and well-being. Meanwhile, Maria struggled with a new assignment that required her to operate a machine she hadn't been properly trained on. Brad hovered, criticizing her for being slow, never once acknowledging that she lacked the basic training to do the job efficiently. Each time Maria tried to ask a question, he rolled his eyes or cut her off. "Figure it out," he barked, his voice echoing above the machinery. Maria's eyes flicked to Ethan, a silent plea for help, but Ethan could only offer a supportive nod. He clenched his fists, rage simmering. This was a woman who was already juggling a difficult life outside these walls. Now she was thrown into a new role without guidance, being belittled by a man who saw her as nothing more than a weak link. If that wasn't conflict enough, there was more. A rumor spread that the next round of paychecks would see another insurance deduction. No one knew what that meant, but everyone dreaded it. The hush across the factory floor was palpable, like a storm about to break. Near lunchtime, Ethan slipped into a quiet corner to gather his thoughts. He overheard Tom speaking to another veteran worker, an older woman named Carmen. They complained that they hadn't been paid their overtime rates in months. Carmen said, "We should form a group and protest. But nobody will back us, not after that fiasco last year." Ethan's ears perked up. Last year? He remembered reading something about a small labor dispute at one of his facilities, but the official report said it was resolved amicably. Clearly, that was a lie. Carmen went on. "We tried to bring our concerns to upper management, but they just told us to speak with our supervisors. That led straight to Brad and his cronies. Next thing we knew, half of us got written up or fired." She shook her head, frustration etched in every line of her face. Now everyone's too scared to speak. They'll put up with anything to keep a paycheck, no matter how small it gets. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, forcing down the anger that rose like bile. It was a perfect illustration of a broken system. Workers had no voice, no safe channel to communicate, and management leveraged fear and job insecurity to maintain control. He couldn't believe that such a monstrous culture had grown under his watch. But it was there, plain as day, and he couldn't deny it any longer. If he hadn't come down in person, he might never have known the depth of the betrayal, both of his workers and of the values he claimed his company stood for. It struck him that the hidden conflict went beyond one bully supervisor. It was an entire network of intimidation, cost-cutting, and blatant disregard for human dignity. And the deeper he dug, the more horrifying it became. He returned to the line, where Maria was staring at the malfunctioning machine in front of her, tears glistening in her eyes. Brad paced behind her, arms crossed, a smug smirk on his face. "You done yet?" he jeered. "We don't have time for your incompetence," Maria whispered. "I'm trying." But her trembling hands told another story. Ethan wanted to step in, but again, he forced himself to wait. He needed to witness all of it, to gather the undeniable evidence of just how bad things were. Only then could he stage the most effective takedown of this entire toxic regime. His chest tightened with each passing minute as he watched Maria endure scorn, Liam quiver in fear of losing more wages, and Tom grit his teeth at the blatant lack of safety measures. The hidden conflict was no longer hidden to Ethan. It was an all-out war on the dignity of the workforce, and the casualties were the very people who kept the factory running. He vowed silently, it would not go unanswered. The day wore on like a funeral march. Every ticking hour brought new revelations of injustice, each one compounding the weight on Ethan's conscience. When a machine jammed on Liam's line, delaying output by 15 minutes, Brad penalized him for inefficiency. Liam protested, saying it wasn't his fault, the machine was overdue for servicing. Brad's response was to slam a clipboard against a metal table, making everyone jump. "Don't talk back!" he roared. By now, Ethan was sure that at least a few workers suspected he wasn't who he claimed to be. His reaction, his restrained fury, was too telling. But no one openly questioned him, probably out of fear of bringing more trouble upon themselves. He couldn't blame them. The entire environment was saturated with a sense of dread. Tom whispered to Ethan during a brief lull. "We used to have a decent boss here. Guy named Harris. He cared about us. But then upper management decided he wasn't driving enough productivity. They replaced him with Brad. Since then, it's been hell." Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He remembered signing off on a leadership change in the factory a while back, trusting the recommendation of the regional director. The justification had been that productivity goals weren't being met. He'd assumed it was just standard procedure. Never had he imagined it would lead to a place so grim. The knowledge that his pen stroke had helped usher in Brad's reign made him feel nauseous. It wasn't just the relentless pressure. There was also a blatant disregard for basic human compassion. At one point, a worker named Alicia injured her hand when a poorly maintained lever snapped back unexpectedly. She let out a yelp and clutched her wrist. Instead of rushing to her side, Brad rolled his eyes and muttered something about wasting time. Alicia, tears in her eyes, tried to wave off assistance, clearly afraid of being punished for holding up production. Ethan hurried over, instinct pushing him to make sure she was okay. He found her trembling, her hand already starting to swell. I'm fine, she insisted, obviously terrified of losing her job. That moment made it more than clear. These people felt they had no safety net, no recourse. They were at the mercy of Brad and whichever higher-ups supported him, possibly including people in Ethan's own circle who were manipulating the financials to make it look like everything was great. As the afternoon droned on, Ethan witnessed another humiliating moment. A veteran worker, maybe late 50s, struggled with a heavy crate. She slipped, and the crate tumbled to the floor, spilling parts everywhere. Brad exploded, spewing insults about her age and telling her that maybe it was time she considered early retirement. The worker's face crumpled, but she kept picking up parts in silence. No one dared help her. Ethan's heart twisted painfully as he watched. This was the reality behind the polished corporate facade, behind the mission statements claiming, "We value our team." Every statement was a hollow lie. And the worst part was, the employees knew it. They'd been living it day after day, year after year. Sometime toward the end of the shift, an unexpected voice spoke up. Another supervisor, a woman named Deborah, quietly pulled Ethan aside. "I don't know who you are," she began, her voice low, "but I can tell you're not just a regular temp. I've seen that look before, someone trying to right a wrong. I've tried to file reports about Brad. They disappear. If you're here to fix things, do it fast. People are suffering." Ethan looked into her eyes and saw desperation mixed with a faint glimmer of hope. He gave a small nod. "I'll do what I can," he murmured. He had to be careful not to break his cover outright, but Deborah seemed to sense the gravity of his words. She disappeared back into the throng of workers, leaving Ethan reeling with conflicting emotions. So not all supervisors were complicit. Some were powerless, just like the line workers. He knew the situation was escalating. Tensions were mounting, and the slightest push could send everything into chaos. One worker, a burly man in his 30s, finally snapped when Brad accused him of goofing off, while he was actually checking for a loose bolt. The man rounded on Brad, fists clenched. "You think we're machines? We're people. If we don't fix these problems, someone's gonna get killed." His voice rose above the cacophony. Brad, momentarily stunned, regained his composure and fired back. "Get out. You're done here." The man paled. He looked around at his co-workers, but none dared speak up. Then he trudged to the locker area, removing his gloves in defeat. Ethan stood rooted in place, seething. Another casualty of a system run amok. The man was right. An accident big enough to cost someone's life was just around the corner if these conditions continued. And in that moment, Ethan felt something snap inside him. He was done observing. He'd seen more than enough. In a day or two, he would reveal the truth. But first, he needed to witness one last push, one final straw that would justify him bringing the hammer down without mercy. At the end of the shift, Brad gathered everyone for a motivation talk. It was nothing short of a tirade. He berated them for low output, threatened more pay deductions if numbers didn't improve, and warned that anyone caught complaining would be shown the door. His words were poison, and the workers stood there, heads down, absorbing every hateful syllable. Ethan glanced around the circle. These were the very people who built his products, who made his company profitable. They looked like prisoners. The next morning, Ethan resolved he would put his plan into motion. The hidden conflict had never been hidden to those who suffered, it was only hidden from him. But now, eyes open and heart burning with righteous anger, he was ready to bring it all crashing down. Somewhere between fury and determination, Ethan knew a confrontation was inevitable. That morning, he arrived even earlier than usual. As he pulled on the grimy gloves that now felt too familiar, he glanced around at the workers trickling in. Dark circles under their eyes, shoulders slumped, forced half-smiles when they recognized him. He'd gained a measure of trust simply by sharing in their hardships, but he was still an outsider in their eyes, just a temp who happened to be sympathetic. Little did they know the power he wielded. Today, he planned to use it. He just needed the right catalyst, the moment when the injustice became too glaring to ignore. Even Brad wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it once Ethan revealed who he really was. Within the first hour of the shift, a pressing machine jammed again. Sparks flew, and the operator let out a frightened yelp. Workers scrambled to shut it down, but it took precious minutes. Brad came storming over, already pointing fingers. "Who was on this machine? Why the hell can't you people keep it running?" His eyes landed on Maria, who'd been helping guide some materials. She tried to explain that the jam was likely due to mechanical failure, not human error. But Brad wouldn't hear it. He drew closer, towering over her, and snapped, "You incompetent fool! You'll pay for this!" Maria backed away, her face ashen. Ethan felt his blood pound in his ears. In that moment, he realized he couldn't stand by. This was it, the confrontation he'd been waiting for. He stepped forward, heart thundering in his chest. "She didn't do anything wrong," he said, voice firm. He braced himself for what came next. Brad wheeled on him, face contorted in anger. "Who do you think you are? You've been here 5 minutes and you think you can talk back?" His spit flecked the air. Workers froze, eyes wide, as if collectively holding their breath. Ethan squared his shoulders. "I'm someone who won't let you bully people anymore." The hush that fell was deafening. Brad blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the boldness. Then, regaining his venom, he snarled, "You're fired. Get out." For a heartbeat, Ethan considered playing dumb a little longer, but no, that time had passed. He reached into his back pocket, pulling out his wallet and extracting his corporate ID card. He held it up high so everyone could see. "I'm Ethan Carter, CEO of this entire operation," he announced, voice echoing across the machinery. A stunned silence rippled through the crowd. Maria's jaw dropped, Tom's eyes widened, and Liam looked as if he might faint. Brad's face went from red to white in an instant. Nobody moved. It was as if the entire factory had turned to stone, each person trying to process the seismic shift in power dynamics. Ethan took a step closer to Brad, holding his gaze. "You've been terrorizing my workers, cutting corners, risking lives. And I've seen it all." Brad tried to stammer an excuse, something about just following orders, but his usual bluster had dissolved. Ethan's voice rose, fueled by the pent-up rage of everything he'd witnessed. "I have emails, pay stubs, testimonies from these people. You threatened them, penalized them for machine malfunctions, denied them breaks." He pointed to the jammed pressing machine, still emitting wisps of smoke. "And you've neglected essential maintenance. That ends now." Brad lifted his chin, a final display of arrogance. "You don't understand, sir. We had directives from upper management to increase productivity by any means necessary." There it was, the attempt to shift blame. Ethan didn't let him finish. "I gave no directive to endanger lives or treat employees like disposable parts. If you had concerns, you should have brought them to me or the board. Instead, you created a toxic hellscape." His voice shook with fury. The factory floor was deathly quiet, all eyes on the showdown. Some workers smiled, albeit hesitantly, while others wore looks of disbelief, as if they couldn't believe Brad was finally getting called out. Maria took a small step back, as though she feared a violent reaction from Brad. But the man simply stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Ethan turned his gaze to the workers. "All of you, I'm sorry. You should never have had to endure this. But hear me now. We're shutting down this facility until a full investigation can be completed." Gasps followed, some of relief, some of worry. A shutdown meant no immediate paycheck, but also the end of the torment. He continued, "I will personally ensure every worker here is compensated, and every safety measure is implemented before we reopen. Those who were wrongfully fired will be given the option to return. And Brad." He turned back, staring the supervisor down. "Brad is done. Effective immediately." A murmur of shock and a ripple of applause broke out among the workers. They glanced at each other with cautious hope. Liam let out a breath he seemed to have been holding all week. Tom nodded solemnly, as if a great weight had finally been lifted. Maria actually covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. For a moment, Brad just stood there, sweat beading on his brow, his arrogance deflated. Then he stammered, "You can't just close the whole operation. That'll cost millions. The board will never allow it." Ethan didn't waver. "I founded this company. The board answers to me, not the other way around. If it costs millions, so be it. I refuse to make another dime off the backs of abused workers." Brad's eyes flicked around, looking for an escape, perhaps a final lifeline. But security personnel, alerted by one of the floor workers who recognized Ethan, were already arriving. 2 uniformed guards strode forward, uncertain at first, until Ethan nodded. That was all the confirmation they needed. They took Brad by the arms. He sputtered protests, but no one came to his defense. Not a single supervisor or manager stepped forward. They were all frozen, caught between relief and terror, unsure if they'd be next. Ethan addressed them, his voice booming with authority. Anyone who aided in these abuses, who lied to cover up the truth, will face consequences. But if you're willing to cooperate, speak up now. Help me fix this mess. A few supervisors, including Deborah, who had quietly confided in Ethan earlier, stepped forward with trembling resolve. They looked like people who'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. Maria exhaled a sob, covering her face with both hands. Liam broke into a grin so wide it looked foreign on his perpetually anxious face. Tom patted Ethan on the back, tears glistening in his weathered eyes. Never thought I'd see the day, he whispered. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He realized in that moment just how desperately these people had needed someone to stand up for them. It took him going undercover to finally see the truth, but at least he saw it. Now he could act on it. There was no going back. This confrontation marked the official end of Brad's regime. As the security guards escorted him out, the entire factory erupted in applause. Some workers cursed at him under their breath. Others simply watched, still in a state of shock. Ethan turned to the crowd once more, raising his hands to quiet them. Go home to your families. This factory will remain closed for a thorough investigation and restructuring. You will all be kept on payroll during the closure, pending individual evaluations. I promise we'll make this right. People nodded, some openly weeping at the news that they wouldn't lose their livelihood. Others looked skeptical. Could they trust him? He understood their doubt. Actions would have to speak louder than words in the days to come. With Brad's exit, the first major step had been taken, but the battle was far from over. The entire system needed an overhaul. But for now, this confrontation was a start. It was the catalyst that would lead to real change. Ethan stood there, chest heaving, adrenaline coursing through him, as the crowd began dispersing. A sense of grim satisfaction settled over him. He had wanted a confrontation, and he'd gotten one, loud, public, and humiliating for the man who had caused so much suffering. In the hush that followed, he felt a wave of relief crash over him. It was done. The darkness had been dragged into the light. And no matter how messy the fallout might be, he knew in his heart he'd done what was necessary. In the immediate aftermath, the factory floor erupted into a mixture of jubilation and stunned disbelief. Some employees hurriedly gathered their belongings, as if afraid someone would change their mind and order them back to work. Others huddled in small groups, whispering about what had just happened, recounting the epic confrontation they never thought they'd witness. A few let out cathartic cheers, hugging one another. The tension that had weighed so heavily on them seemed to lift all at once, replaced by a cautious but electrifying sense of hope. Ethan remained, leaning against a metal beam, his mind spinning with the gravity of what he'd just set in motion. He'd effectively shut down operations, which would send shockwaves through the entire company. But as he watched Maria sink to her knees in relief, Liam wiping tears from his face, and Tom standing tall for the first time in ages, Ethan knew he'd made the right call. With Brad gone, the remaining supervisors didn't know what to do. Deborah stepped forward to fill the silence. All right, folks, she called out, trying to sound confident. Let's start shutting everything down safely. No rush. We want to make sure everything is powered off properly. She glanced at Ethan for approval, and he gave her a nod. Slowly, stations were powered down, machines were put into standby, and the conveyor belts ground to a halt. It was a surreal scene, like time itself had frozen in the factory. Some workers removed their safety gear, shaking out stiff necks and sore shoulders, no longer worried they'd be reprimanded for stopping work. A couple of technicians began final checks on the more temperamental machines, ensuring they wouldn't burst into flames once everyone left. Ethan reached Maria, who was still on her knees. He helped her up gently. She looked at him with gratitude shining in her eyes. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Thank you? Ethan tried to smile. I'm sorry it took so long, he replied quietly. He meant every word. He thought of how much suffering had gone unnoticed while he'd been signing documents in a plush office, trusting false reports from middle management. A pang of guilt hit him again, but he pushed it aside. Now wasn't the time for self-flagellation. There was too much work to do to set things right. Nearby, Liam exhaled a long breath. I can't believe this. I was sure I'd lose my job for good, he admitted. I've got a kid at home, bills to pay. Ethan nodded. Not on my watch, he said firmly. We'll make sure you get what you're owed. Back pay, proper breaks, all of it. Tom approached, a small smile tugging at his tired features. You did it, kid, he said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder with surprising gentleness. I might be old, but I've seen a lot in my time. Never thought I'd see the day the big boss came down here and actually took action. Ethan chuckled dryly. Neither did I, Tom. I just wish I'd done it sooner. They shared a moment of silent understanding. Then Tom turned, addressing the group of workers around him, telling them to gather their tools properly, reminding them that this was likely their last shift for a while. But hey, he added, voice cracking a little, at least we'll have something to come back to that isn't run by a monster. A chorus of relieved murmurs followed. Some workers even broke into shaky laughter, the tension finally releasing like air from a balloon. Deborah, who had been overseeing the shutdown procedures, approached Ethan. We should probably announce how the shutdown will be handled, she said, clearly stepping into an interim leadership role. People are worried about pay. Some are scared they'll lose everything if the factory stays closed for too long. Ethan nodded, fully aware that he needed to address them. He climbed onto a small wooden crate, catching the attention of everyone who was still present. His heart pounded as he searched for the right words. He'd spoken at investor conferences, board meetings, and product launches, but never in a moment like this, raw, emotional, and charged with moral weight. I know you're all concerned about what happens next, he began, voice carrying across the silent factory floor. I won't sugarcoat this. The factory will remain closed for however long it takes to complete a thorough investigation and overhaul. That means no one is expected to come in tomorrow or the day after. A wave of anxious murmurs passed through the crowd. He raised a hand to quiet them. But I promise you this, you will be compensated during this period. If you choose to return once we reopen, you'll have a job waiting for you. We will have new management, new safety protocols, and better pay structures. That is my personal guarantee. There was a moment of hesitation, then scattered applause. Some were still skeptical, but others clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be different now. He hopped down from the crate, feeling an odd mixture of relief and responsibility. Maria approached him again, tears still glistening. That's more than we could have asked for, she said. But are you sure? What about the board? Ethan took a deep breath. The board can fight me on it if they want. But I started this company with my own 2 hands. If I lose some investor confidence, so be it. I'd rather do the right thing than run a profitable sweatshop. She nodded, wiping her cheeks. Thank you? Really? He offered a small smile, though inside he felt the weight of the challenges ahead. He'd have to meet with lawyers, auditors, and possibly regulators. There would be mountains of paperwork, media scrutiny, and likely more betrayals to uncover. But in that moment, he felt a surge of moral clarity. He was doing this not just for Maria or Tom or Liam, but for every person who worked under the shadow of greed and cruelty. As employees began trickling out, some stopped to shake Ethan's hand or offer him a grateful nod. Others walked out in stunned silence, still trying to process how the worst day in the factory's history ended up being the first day of real hope. Liam lingered near the doorway, taking one last look at the gutted machines. I used to think I'd have to leave to find a better life, he said softly to Ethan. Now, maybe I'll stay, see what happens. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on Liam's shoulder. I hope you do, he replied. Because it's people like you who are the heart of this place, not people like Brad. Liam nodded, offering a ghost of a smile, before stepping out into the fresh air. One by one, workers cleared the floor, leaving behind a cavernous space filled with silent equipment and the echoes of a day's turmoil. Ethan surveyed the empty factory. It felt like standing in the aftermath of a storm, debris everywhere, but the air was oddly still. He could almost feel the building exhale, freed from the toxic presence that had tainted it for too long. Deborah tapped him on the shoulder, giving him a thin smile. "I'll make sure everything's secured," she said. "Then I'm heading home too." Ethan nodded, thanking her. As she walked away, he let out a long breath, shoulders sagging with the enormity of what lay ahead. Yet a part of him felt lighter than it had in years. He had taken responsibility for a problem he didn't even know existed. The immediate aftermath was messy, emotional, and chaotic, but also liberating. He had given these people something they hadn't had in a long time, a reason to believe that their work and their rights mattered. Darkness had fallen by the time Ethan left the factory. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few cars belonging to the skeleton crew locking up. He climbed into his own modest rental car. He'd avoided bringing his usual luxury vehicle to maintain his cover. Sitting behind the wheel, he felt a wave of exhaustion crash over him. But there was also a tight coil of resolve in his chest. Tomorrow, he'd convene an emergency meeting with his board. He knew some of them would protest. He'd likely get an earful about lost productivity and the blow to quarterly earnings. But for once, he didn't care about the spreadsheets. Let them see the photos, the testimonies, the broken machines, and the battered morale. Let them see how close the company had come to a tragedy that money could never fix. Driving home, he thought about how he'd break the news to the public. The media would likely spin the story in various directions. CEO exposes own factory, company shuts down over labor abuses. Or worse. He would have to face it head-on, not hide behind PR doublespeak. He'd spent enough time hiding from the truth, trusting yes-men to keep him informed. That era was over. He was determined to rip off the bandage completely. And if that meant losing investors or market share, so be it. Better to lose money than to lose one's conscience. He parked at his home, a comfortable estate that suddenly felt too large, and entered, ignoring the automated lights that flickered on to welcome him. Instead, he headed straight for his office, switching on a single lamp. The quiet hum of the air conditioner was the only sound as he slumped into his desk chair. For a long moment, he just sat there, replaying the day's events in his head. He could still see Brad's face, that mixture of shock and fury when Ethan revealed his identity. He could still hear Maria's half-choked sob of relief, Tom's subdued smile, Liam's trembling voice. Those images were seared into his memory now, a permanent reminder of the reality he'd uncovered. That night, he drafted an internal memo, detailing the immediate steps he planned to take, an audit of all factories, a hotline for employee complaints that would go directly to him, a temporary freeze on certain managerial powers until the investigation concluded, and a vow to pay every worker during the shutdown. By the time he finished typing, the clock read well past midnight. His eyes were grainy with exhaustion, but he felt a grim satisfaction in hitting send. It was the first step in what would be a lengthy process, but it was a start. The next morning came too soon. He found himself in a high-rise boardroom, surrounded by executives in suits and ties. Some looked uneasy, having heard rumors. Others were visibly angry. A few tried to feign confusion. Ethan wasted no time. He projected photos of the factory conditions, played a short video he'd secretly recorded showing Brad berating workers, then laid out the financial records that showed suspicious wage deductions. The room fell silent. When he was done, one board member cleared his throat, stammering, "We had no idea it was this bad." Another tried to deflect, blaming middle management. Ethan cut them off. "This is on all of us," he said, voice resolute. "But especially me. I trusted the wrong people and ignored warning signs. That ends now." Some board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but he pressed on, detailing the shutdown, the planned investigation, and the guaranteed pay for workers during the closure. A murmur of dissent rose. "Too costly. Bad for quarterly numbers, investors won't like it. Ethan stood firm, glaring at them. I don't care if the share price dips. You think it's worse than a headline about an employee losing a limb or a life because of our negligence? Or a class action lawsuit for wage theft? We do the right thing now, or we'll pay for it 1,000 times over. That shut them up, at least for the moment. Over the next few days, as word spread about the shutdown, Ethan received a flurry of calls, some supportive, some outraged. He ignored most of them, focusing on the internal cleanup. He hired an independent auditing firm to interview employees and review payroll records, safety standards, and managerial practices. Deborah and other conscientious supervisors volunteered to assist, giving detailed accounts of how Brad and his allies manipulated reports. All the while, Ethan kept an eye on the workers. He arranged for them to pick up interim paychecks, ensuring no one was left high and dry. Some were openly grateful, others still suspicious. He didn't blame them. He needed to earn back their trust. Weeks passed, and the factory floor underwent a transformation. Broken machines were either repaired or replaced, worn-out safety gear was tossed, and new equipment was ordered. Signs went up reminding workers of their rights, mandatory breaks, safety protocols, direct lines to HR that actually worked. But the biggest shift was intangible, the atmosphere. No longer did the building radiate dread. Workers would come in to see the changes, nodding with cautious optimism. Maria told Ethan she was able to pay her rent without worry for the first time in months. Liam brought his little boy to see the big machines, and the child marveled at them. Tom walked with a bit more spring in his step, even helping train newcomers. It was like the soul of the place was finally allowed to breathe. As part of the investigation, Ethan held meetings where workers could speak freely about their experiences. Many were still shaken by Brad's reign, but gradually stories poured out about wage theft, intimidation, safety hazards, and how it all tied to certain mid-level executives who'd signed off on efficiency measures. Those executives were summarily dismissed. Some faced legal repercussions, depending on their level of involvement. It was a messy, painful process, but it was necessary. Ethan refused to let the company revert to the oppressive culture he'd discovered on his undercover journey. The emotional payoff came when the newly restructured factory reopened. Employees gathered in the main hall, uncertain but hopeful. A hush fell as Ethan addressed them. Gone was the facade of a distant corporate figure. He spoke to them man to man, acknowledging past mistakes, promising a future built on mutual respect. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. Maria wiped away tears, Tom grinned like he hadn't in years, and Liam clapped so hard his palms turned red. That final day in the reopened factory was more emotional than any ribbon-cutting ceremony Ethan had ever attended. He walked the line in his normal attire now, no disguise needed. Workers greeted him with genuine smiles. Some still seemed awestruck that the man who once loomed high above them in an executive suite had literally stepped down into their shoes. He checked in on the new break room, bright and spacious, stocked with fresh water and comfortable seating. He saw updated safety stations with extra gloves, goggles, and earplugs in abundance. A small kiosk displayed direct numbers for HR and an anonymous tip line that fed straight to an independent firm. Changes that once seemed small on paper now felt monumental in practice. He paused by a refurbished machine, watching Tom and Liam demonstrate the correct procedure to a couple of new hires. The instructions included hazard warnings, safe speeds, and how to shut it down in case of an emergency. The new hires listened attentively, unafraid to ask questions. No one hovered over them, barking orders or threatening their jobs. Instead, Tom patted one on the back, joking, "We want you in one piece at the end of the day, kid." Ethan swallowed a lump in his throat. This, he realized, was how a workplace should feel: collaborative, respectful, safe. A far cry from the hellscape he'd first encountered. It took shutting the entire place down and sifting through its darkest corners to get here, but the transformation was real. Maria caught him near the time clock. She had a small gift in her hands, a homemade keychain with the company logo on one side and the words, "Thank you," on the other. Her voice trembled with emotion. I made this for you. Just so you remember this place, remember what we went through. Ethan accepted the keychain gently. I won't ever forget, he promised. Not for a second. She smiled, eyes glistening. It's good to see the floor open again. And not be scared. She clocked in with a determined nod. He watched her walk away, shoulders squared, a new sense of pride in her stride. He then spotted Liam leaning against the rail, his phone out, likely texting his family. Liam looked up, caught Ethan's eye, and waved. Thanks, boss, he mouthed silently. Ethan nodded, heart heavy yet fulfilled. Later, at a brief assembly, he stood before the workers, the same crate from before acting as his makeshift podium. But this time, there was no frantic confrontation, no fear in the air. He spoke earnestly about the company's next steps, about the new complaint process, about forming a worker-led committee to ensure ongoing improvements. He encouraged them to speak freely if something ever felt off. Their applause felt different from that day of Brad's firing, less frantic, more genuine. It was an applause of recognition, a shared understanding that they were all in this together. The final wrap-up of the day came when Tom approached him, arms folded with a gentle smile. So what now, Mr. CO? He asked, half joking. Ethan chuckled. Now we do what we should have done all along, listen to each other and make decisions together. No more secrets, no more abuses. Tom nodded thoughtfully. Sounds good to me, he said, heading back to his station. As the shift progressed, Ethan strolled around, offering help here and there, marveling at how quickly the atmosphere had changed. Sure, it wasn't perfect. Some folks were still wary, a few were jaded from years of mistreatment. But the seeds of a new culture were planted. This time, no one would be forced to choose between their dignity and a paycheck. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan lingered in the factory, watching the workers clock out. Maria waved goodbye. Liam gave him a thumbs up. Deborah offered a warm smile, relief evident on her face. Each gesture resonated with him, a testament to the new chapter unfolding. Finally, with the building growing quiet, Ethan stepped outside. The same parking lot where he once stood in disguise now felt like a different world. The neon sign of the company glowed overhead, and he looked up at it, remembering how proud he'd once been to see his business thrive. He still felt pride, but it was tempered by humility. Leadership, he realized, wasn't about sitting in a fancy office making decisions from spreadsheets. It was about understanding the realities of your people, standing beside them when it mattered most. He pulled out the keychain Maria had given him, turning it over in his hand. Thank you, it read. He closed his fist around it, silently vowing to never forget the lessons learned. In the end, he hadn't just shut down a factory, he'd torn down an entire mindset of exploitation. And he rebuilt something stronger, more humane in its place. The final sigh of relief came as he walked to his car, feeling the cool evening air brush against his face, no longer haunted by what he might find within those walls. He drove away with the knowledge that real change had begun, that people like Maria, Tom, and Liam would no longer suffer in silence. It was a humble victory, but a victory all the same. And as he merged onto the dark road, he felt oddly light, as if an enormous burden had lifted from his shoulders. He thought of the words he'd spoken to the board. I refuse to make another dime off the backs of abused workers. That, he decided, was a line he would never cross again. And it was in that final, lingering thought that he found true closure.